Oh. That craft can eat through the hull.
Before Ridley Scott made a single frame of Alien, 20th Century Fox had already rejected the script more than once. A rival director had scoffed at the whole concept, and the future star of the film thought she'd already lost the job to somebody else. None of that stopped a $4 million B-movie pitch from becoming one of the most influential films ever made. A movie so committed to its own grime and dread that the crew building it kept crossing lines that most productions wouldn't touch. Real bones, real organs, real fear. What's striking, looking back at the production history, is how consistently the people making this film chose the harder, messier, more literal option over the easier fake. Where a lot of genre filmmaking in the late 1970s was happy to lean on obvious rubber monsters and matte painting shortcuts, the Alien production kept reaching for real biology, real scale tricks, and real discomfort whenever a synthetic substitute risked looking cheap. That instinct is a big part of why the film still holds up as unsettling nearly half a century later, long after most of its era's practical effects have aged into camp. Today we're counting down 15 facts about the making of Alien that sound too strange to be true, and every single one of them is. Stick around for number 1, because the most famous monster head in movie history isn't entirely a prop. Like, subscribe, and let's get into it. Start with the one that still catches people off guard, even fans who've seen Alien a dozen times. The Xenomorph's iconic elongated head isn't just sculpted rubber and resin. Underneath the smooth, dome-shaped skull, there's an actual human skull riveted into place. The story goes back to Swiss artist H.R. Geiger, who designed the creature and insisted on working from real anatomy rather than a plastic medical supply skull. According to accounts from screenwriter Dan O'Bannon, who was on set during construction, the production sourced 3 human skulls that had originally been prepared in India for medical and educational use, reportedly costing around $700 apiece. O'Bannon later recalled being struck by how flawless the teeth were, with no fillings or wear, which made him quietly suspicious about where exactly they'd come from. Geiger took one of the 3 skulls, jammed it into the front of the creature's head form, riveted it in, then went to work with a hacksaw, sawing off the jawbone and extending it several inches to build the alien's now famous elongated snout. Everything else, the smooth biomechanical shell, the domed cranium, was built around that human anatomical core, essentially using a real skeleton as scaffolding for a monster. Geiger reportedly confirmed the detail directly in a later interview, simply answering, "Yes, that's true," when asked about it. It's the kind of decision that tells you everything about how this production approached practical effects. Not close enough, but genuinely unsettling by design, hidden in plain sight under layers of latex and slime that nobody in the audience ever got close enough to see through. Sticking with the head for a second, because there's another detail buried in there that's almost as strange. To get the Xenomorph's inner mouth and jaw structure looking wet, stretchy, and organic, like something with real muscle and tendon underneath, the effects crew reportedly used ordinary condoms, stretched and layered to fake the look of sinewy tissue around the creature's lips and the base of its extending jaw. It sounds almost too simple to work, but that's the trick behind a lot of pre-CGI creature effects. Household materials, applied with enough craft, read as biological on camera in ways that molded rubber alone never quite manages. Combined with the real skull underneath, the head became a strange hybrid object, part human remains, part contraceptive rubber, part hydraulics, built by a production that clearly didn't care what the parts list looked like as long as the final image was convincing. If the head was unsettling because of what was hidden, the facehugger was unsettling because of what wasn't. For the scene where Ash dissects the creature on the medical table, the effects team didn't rely on sculpted silicone innards. Behind-the-scenes accounts describe the prop being filled with genuine oysters, clams, scallops, and sheep intestines, actual butcher shop and fishmonger ingredients standing in for alien anatomy. The reasoning was practical rather than gratuitous. Rubber and synthetic gel tend to look flat and rubbery under studio lighting, especially in close-up. Real organic tissue has a wetness, an irregularity, a way of catching light that's very hard to fake. So instead of trying to sculpt something that looked convincingly alive, the production simply used things that already were biological, just not human. It's a detail that sums up a lot of Alien's practical effects philosophy. Whenever a synthetic substitute risked looking like a prop, the crew reached for the real thing instead, even if that meant working with rotting seafood between takes. There's also a practical, unglamorous downside to that decision that rarely makes it into the highlight reels. Organic material doesn't hold up well under hot studio lights for hours at a time, and accounts from people involved in the production described the smell on set becoming genuinely difficult to work around as shooting days wore on. It's easy to romanticize practical effects in hindsight as more honest than CGI, and in a lot of ways they are. But moments like this are a reminder that the honesty came with a very literal cost for everyone standing near the table. The chestburster dinner table sequence is one of the most analyzed scenes in horror history, and part of why it still lands is that the reactions on screen are, to a significant degree, genuine. The actors knew from the script that John Hurt's character, Kane, was going to die violently at the table. What they weren't fully prepared for was the scale and mechanics of how Ridley Scott intended to shoot it. Cast members have described walking onto set that day and noticing something off before a single line was said. Crew members standing around the table in plastic raincoats and face shields, protective gear that has nothing to do with a normal dinner scene. Underneath the table sat high-pressure hoses rigged to blast fake blood and prop organ material through Hurt's chest piece on cue, and the crew was clearly bracing for a mess far bigger than anyone at the table had been told to expect. When the gag went off, several actors reacted with visible, unrehearsed shock. Sigourney Weaver has spoken about that moment as the point where she realized just how far Scott was willing to push a surprise for the sake of an authentic reaction. Scott shot the sequence essentially in a single take, banking on the idea that startled, half-improvised horror is nearly impossible to fake convincingly, and that the safest way to get it was to simply not over-rehearse his own cast. The aftermath reportedly took a real toll. Cast members have described needing a lengthy break before shooting could continue, with the crew stepping away from the table for hours rather than moving straight into cleanup and the next setup. It's a scene that's been parodied and referenced constantly in the decades since, which can make it easy to forget that underneath the now familiar gag, the version audiences see on screen is largely a document of a small group of actors being genuinely blindsided by their own director on a closed set. Here's one that still surprises people who assume Sigourney Weaver was always the obvious pick. Veronica Cartwright, who ultimately played Navigator Joan Lambert, had actually read for the role of Ripley, first in Los Angeles and then again in London, and by most accounts believed the part was hers. According to multiple retrospectives and interviews given over the years, Cartwright only learned the role had shifted to Weaver once production was already underway, discovering the change during a costume fitting when the wardrobe department began preparing measurements for Lambert instead. Ridley Scott made the switch shortly before filming began, and Weaver, a relative unknown at the time, primarily known for stage and a couple of small film credits, stepped into what would become one of the most iconic roles in science fiction history. It's a reminder of how close a defining piece of pop culture casting history came to landing completely differently, and how thin the margin was between two actresses who ended up delivering very different, but equally memorable, performances in the same film. Cartwright wasn't the only name in the mix before Weaver locked in the role. Casting records and later interviews indicate that Meryl Streep was approached about the part early on, though she reportedly wasn't formally contacted at the time because of a personal loss she was dealing with. Established leads including Genevieve Bujold and Catherine Ross were also discussed for the role, according to documentary accounts of the casting process, alongside British actress Helen Mirren, who auditioned as well. Weaver herself was actually the last actor cast in the film, largely on the strength of an audition that impressed director Ridley Scott and producers David Giler and Walter Hill enough to hand a first-time film lead to someone with almost no screen resume. It's worth remembering, too, that Ripley wasn't written with a specific gender in mind. The screenplay left character genders ambiguous, which is part of why a role written generically as the surviving officer ended up going to a woman in a genre that, in 1979, rarely handed women that kind of role. The man inside the Xenomorph suit had never acted before in his life. Bolaji Badejo was a 26-year-old graphic design student living in London when a casting agent for the production, reportedly named Peter Archer, spotted him having a drink in a Soho pub and was struck by his build. Badejo stood roughly 6 feet 10 inches tall, with an extremely long, slender frame that matched almost exactly what the production was looking for, something closer to an insect than a person. Associate producer Ivor Powell has described the team's original vision as being modeled on a praying mantis, someone tall enough, and proportioned strangely enough, that crouching down would still read as unnervingly large and angular on camera. Scott had previously looked at basketball players for the role, and had even screen-tested Peter Mayhew, the actor who played Chewbacca in Star Wars, before meeting Badejo and deciding, by most accounts almost instantly, that he'd found his creature. Special effects supervisor Nick Alder later described his own first impression of Badejo walking onto set alongside Scott, saying it felt like watching a giraffe come through the door, someone so tall that his head sat above the frame of a normal doorway before the rest of his body had even come into view. Before any suit fitting could begin, the production had a full body cast made of Badejo, which reportedly required him to stand completely still, unclothed, for an extended period so the mold could capture his exact proportions, an unusually demanding ask for someone who, a few weeks earlier, had simply been a graphic design student with no connection to the film industry at all. Because Badejo had zero acting background, the production didn't just hand him a suit and a call sheet. He was put through mime training and Tai Chi instruction specifically to control the slow, deliberate, almost fluid quality of the creature's movement, the opposite of a typical monster movie stalk and lunge. The goal, according to people who worked with him, was a kind of unsettling gracefulness, a predator that never looked like it was hurrying, because it never needed to. Badejo also reportedly worked with trainers to build specific muscle definition for the physically demanding suit work. Alien ended up being his only screen credit. He returned to Nigeria not long after filming, eventually opening an art gallery, and he died in 1992 at the age of 39 from complications of sickle cell disease. A detail that means one of the most recognizable movie monsters ever put on film was portrayed exactly once, by someone who stepped into the role almost by accident, and then simply went back to the rest of his life. Every human character on the Nostromo was expendable. The cat, evidently, was not. Jonesy, the orange tabby who rides out the entire film relatively unbothered, was portrayed by 4 separate, nearly identical ginger cats, each apparently used for a different specialized task. One trained to sit calmly for extended handling, one for movement and cued action, one for reaction shots involving hissing or distress, and one that mainly just needed to look composed on camera. There's a good behind-the-scenes footnote here involving Sigourney Weaver. According to widely reported production trivia, the first day Weaver filmed a scene involving the cat, her skin began reacting badly, and she briefly panicked that she was allergic, assuming the production would simply recast her rather than track down 4 more matching cats. It turned out she wasn't reacting to the cat at all, but to the glycerin being sprayed on her skin to simulate sweat and heat. Once the glycerin was addressed, the scenes with Jonesy continued without further incident, and the cat went on to become one of the more beloved footnotes in the franchise's history. The space jockey sequence, where the crew discovers the fossilized alien pilot slumped in its chair aboard the derelict ship, needed to feel absolutely massive. The problem was that the actual set, while large by any normal standard, still wasn't reading as big enough on camera. Scott has described walking onto the set and looking at the landing leg of the Nostromo's approach structure, which stretched roughly 50 feet to the studio ceiling, and immediately deciding it simply didn't look large enough for the shot he wanted. His solution was an old-school forced perspective trick. Rather than rebuilding a bigger set, he had 3 small spacesuits made, one for his cinematographer Derek Van Lent's child, and 2 for his own children, and placed them in the foreground on a moving elevator platform alongside the landing leg, with small figures positioned close to camera against the same backdrop. The leg that had measured around 50 feet suddenly read as roughly 80 feet tall on screen. The audience's brain does the rest of the scaling work automatically once it has a human-shaped reference point to judge by. It's the same core principle Hollywood had been using since the golden age of studio filmmaking. Small figures in the foreground selling scale for a background that isn't actually as big as it looks, deployed here to sell one of the film's most haunting, wordless ideas, that the crew of the Nostromo had stumbled into something built on a scale that dwarfed anything human. Alien's costume design leaned hard into functional, lived-in realism rather than sleek sci-fi glamour, and that realism came at a physical cost. The bulky EVA suits worn during the planet surface and derelict ship sequences were heavy, poorly ventilated, and worn on sound stages reportedly kept around 38 degrees Celsius, just over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, to help sell the atmosphere and lighting Scott wanted. Between the suit weight, the heat, and limited visibility inside the helmets, cast members are reported to have fainted on set with enough regularity that a nurse had to remain present during those shoots. It's a small, unglamorous detail, but it fits the larger pattern of how this production operated. Comfort for the actors was consistently a lower priority than getting an image on film that felt authentically uncomfortable, exhausting, and real. Before it had the title that's now practically synonymous with dread, Alien existed as a rougher early treatment called Star Beast, developed by screenwriter Dan O'Bannon together with Ronald Shusett. The project had evolved out of an older, unrelated O'Bannon idea about creatures infiltrating a World War II bomber, reworked into a spaceship setting once Shusett suggested combining the concepts. O'Bannon reportedly never liked the Star Beast title, considering it too close to the pulpy B-movie label the film was trying to elevate beyond. Going back through his own drafts, he noticed how often the word alien appeared throughout the script, not just describing the creature, but the ship, the technology, the entire situation the crew found themselves in. Renaming the project Alien gave it a title that worked simultaneously as a noun and an adjective, had apparently never been used as a film title before, and did something the original title never managed. It read less like a promise of adventure and more like a warning label. Alien wasn't greenlit as a lavish production. Reported figures put the original budget in the range of roughly $8 to $9 million, modest even by late 1970s standards for a science fiction film with this level of practical effects and set construction. What helped push the number upward as production continued was largely Scott's own visual pitch work. Coming out of an art school and commercial directing background, Scott famously worked out entire sequences in dense, fully composed storyboards before a single frame was shot, drawings detailed enough to function almost like a shot-by-shot version of the finished film. Those storyboards, later nicknamed Ridley Grams by people who worked with him, gave Fox executives a far clearer sense of the atmosphere and scale he was aiming for than a standard pitch meeting typically would. Combined with his freshly released debut feature The Duelists, which had already caught producers' attention for its visual polish, that groundwork helped Scott secure additional resources for larger, more fully built sets, including expanded Nostromo interiors, as filming progressed toward a final reported budget in the range of $11 to $14 million. H.R. Giger's design work throughout Alien leaned into what he called a biomechanical style, flesh fused with machinery, birth imagery tangled up with menace and decay, and it's well documented in retrospectives on his art that some of his early concepts for the alien egg pushed that imagery further than the studio was comfortable releasing to a general audience. Design historians and writers covering Giger's contribution to the film have noted that his first egg concept, built around a single vertical opening, read to executives as anatomically explicit in a way that risked distracting audiences from the horror the scene was meant to deliver. Rather than softening the concept, accounts of the redesign describe Giger splitting the single opening into 4 petal-like sections that close into a cross shape and peel outward like a blooming, ritualistic structure when the egg activates. The result kept every bit of the original unease intact while reframing it in a way the studio could put on screen, a solution that traded one kind of discomfort for another rather than removing it. Save the biggest industry-level fact for last, because without it, none of the rest of this list happens. Before Star Wars became a phenomenon in 1977, 20th Century Fox and most other studios treated original science fiction scripts as a hard sell, and Dan O'Bannon had been shopping his dark, R-rated, blue-collar crew in space horror script around Hollywood with limited success. Star Wars' runaway box office success changed the calculation almost overnight. Studios that had previously passed on space set scripts suddenly wanted anything with a spaceship attached, and Alien happened to be a finished, well-regarded screenplay already sitting on desks at Fox. Ridley Scott, for his part, had reportedly been developing an entirely different project, a medieval drama loosely inspired by the story of Tristan, before pivoting toward Alien in the aftermath of seeing Star Wars for himself. The result is one of film history's more interesting ironies. A studio chasing another Star Wars-style hit ended up bankrolling something closer to that film's nightmare cousin, a movie about space with none of the wonder and all of the dread. Alien went on to prove that science fiction horror didn't need to be fun to be enormously profitable. It just needed to make an audience afraid to breathe for 2 hours. Released in May 1979, the film would go on to gross well over $100 million worldwide against a budget that had climbed into the low 8 figures, a modest, quietly greenlit monster movie that ended up rewriting what an entire genre was allowed to do. It's worth sitting with how narrow that window actually was. If Star Wars had underperformed, or if O'Bannon's script had landed on desks a year or two earlier, there's a real chance Alien never gets made in anything like the form audiences eventually saw, and an entire lineage of science fiction horror that followed in its wake, from Event Horizon to The Thing to more recent entries in the franchise itself, might never have had a template to build from. Sometimes the most influential films in a genre owe their existence less to a studio's grand creative vision and more to a box office fluke that happened to open a door at exactly